I believe we are living through the beginning of the end. I know how that sounds. People have predicted the end of the world for thousands of years. Every generation has had its wars, its disasters, its prophets, its collapsing empires, and its frightened people staring into the darkness and wondering whether they were witnessing humanity's final chapter. But something about this moment feels different to me. It isn't one disaster that frightens me. It isn't one war, one disease, one economic crisis, one political leader, or one technological invention. It is the accumulation of everything. It is the feeling that problems that once appeared separately are beginning to converge. I look around and see a civilization that has become enormously powerful without becoming equally wise. We can communicate across the planet instantly, yet millions of people feel completely alone. We have access to more information than any civilization in history, yet nobody seems to know what to believe. We have machines capable of performing tasks that once seemed impossible, yet ordinary people increasingly wonder whether there will even be a place for them in the economy of the future. We produce extraordinary amounts of wealth, yet countless people live one emergency away from financial disaster. We have built cities filled with millions of people, yet people walk through those cities without knowing the names of their neighbors. Something has gone wrong. And when I say that, I am not simply talking about politics or economics. I am talking about the human spirit. The world still looks normal. That is what makes the period so strange. If the world were obviously ending, perhaps people would behave differently. If the sky suddenly black and alarms began sounding everywhere, there would be no confusion about what was happening. But that isn't what I see. I see people waking up in the morning. I see buses running. I see restaurants serving dinner. I see packages arriving at people's doors. I see people scrolling through videos, arguing about celebrities, buying clothes, complaining about work, making weekend plans, and wondering what they are going to eat tonight. Civilization performing its daily routine. And yet, underneath that routine, I sense enormous instability. It reminds me of standing inside an old building and noticing cracks appearing. The electricity still works, the water still runs, people still live inside it, but the cracks are there. One crack might not frighten me, 10 cracks would. And when cracks begin appearing everywhere at once, eventually I have to ask whether the foundation itself is moving. That is how the world feels to me now. I see exhaustion everywhere. I don't only see economic problems. I see exhausted people. People are tired of working, tired of worrying about money, tired of politics, tired of social media, tired of bad news, tired of pretending they are doing better than they actually are, tired of trying to keep up with a society that never seems satisfying. Everything demands attention. Everything wants money. Everything wants a password. Everything wants a subscription. Everything wants an opinion. Everything wants us to move faster. And somewhere in this endless acceleration, human beings seem to be losing the ability to simply exist. I think that matters. Civilizations aren't only held together by governments and banks. They are held together by millions of ordinary people believing that tomorrow is worth participating in. People have to believe that working matters, that raising children matters, that building something matters, that saving money matters, that following the rules matter, that sacrificing today might produce something better tomorrow. But what happens when people stop believing that? What happens when millions quietly decide that the future isn't going to be better? That is when something deeper begins breaking. We have lost our sense of permanence. There used to be things people assumed would still exist tomorrow. A career, a neighborhood, a local business. A community, a newspaper, a church, a factory, a family tradition. Maybe none of these things were perfect. Many weren't. But they gave people a sense of the world, that the world had community, continuity. Today, everything feels temporary. Companies disappear. Jobs disappear. Technology becomes obsolete. Neighborhoods transform. Relationships dissolve. Institutions lose credibility. People move constantly. Businesses open and close. Entire industries can be transformed almost overnight. Nothing feels permanent anymore. We have become accustomed to instability. And perhaps that is one of the most dangerous developments of all. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, even chaos. If something shocking happens once, everybody notices. If something shocking happens every week, eventually people barely react. Another crisis, another disaster, another scandal, another war, another record, another emergency, another warning. Another historical event. The words themselves begin losing meaning, and life continues. Technology is moving faster than us. Then there is technology. I don't hate technology. I use it. Almost everyone does. But I cannot ignore what is happening. For most of human history, technological change moved slowly enough that people could build their identities around a certain way of Now the world can change within a few years. Artificial intelligence alone forces me to ask questions that would have sounded like science fiction not long ago. What happens when machines can imitate human voices, human faces, human writing, human art, human conversation? What happens when nobody can easily distinguish between something created by a person and something generated by a machine? What happens to trust? What happens to employment? What happens to identity? What happens when technological systems become so complicated that ordinary people cannot possibly understand the infrastructure controlling their lives? We are building extraordinary, but sometimes I wonder whether humanity is still controlling the tools or whether the tools have begun controlling humanity. Look at people walking down the street. Look at people sitting in restaurants. Look at people waiting for trains. Heads down. Screens glowing. Thumbs moving. Millions of people connected to everything and somehow disconnected from the person standing beside them. If someone from hundreds of years ago suddenly appeared in our world, they might think we were performing some kind of religious ritual. Everyone's staring into little illuminated rectangles, waiting for messages, waiting for approval, waiting for stimulation, waiting for something to happen. Something has happened to community. This is another thing I cannot ignore. People seem lonelier. Not everybody, but enough people that it has become impossible for me not to notice. There are people with hundreds or thousands of online connections who have nobody they feel comfortable calling in the middle of the night. People live beside each other without speaking. Families scatter across enormous distances. Friendships become text messages. Dating becomes profiles. Entertainment becomes personalized algorithms. Shopping becomes packages left outside the door. Work becomes remote. Food becomes delivery. Human interaction becomes optional. Convenience has solved countless problems. But sometimes I wonder what it has quietly taken away. A person can increasingly live without interacting deeply with another human being. That should frighten us more than it does. Because civilization depends upon relationships, trust, cooperation. Patience, compromise, shared experience. A society filled with isolated individuals may still look like a society from the outside, but internally, something essential has disappeared. The earth itself feels unsettled. Then I look at the natural world. Heat, floods, fires, droughts, storms, changing seasons, environmental destruction, species disappearing, water problems, food insecurity. I don't claim that every unusual weather event is some supernatural sign. That would be too easy. But I also refuse to pretend humanity can endlessly alter the planet without consequences. We have built a civilization dependent upon enormous systems of extraction, production, transportation, consumption, and waste. Everything arrives magically on shelves. Food, electronics, clothing, medicine, furniture, fuel. But behind every product is a chain stretching across the planet. Mines, factories, ships, trucks, warehouses, workers, energy, water, land. The modern world feels effortless because most of us never see the machinery keeping it alive. And that machinery is enormous. If enough pieces begin failing simultaneously, our illusion of permanence could disappear very quickly. Money has become another source of fear. I see financial anxiety everywhere. Housing, food, insurance, debt, education, transportation, healthcare, retirement. People calculate everything. Can I afford this? Can I afford that? Can I move? Can I stay? Can I retire? Can I have children? Can I survive an emergency? Can I lose my job? Money has always mattered. But there is something psychologically corrosive about living in constant financial uncertainty. A person cannot think about civilization's future when they are worried about next month's rent. And maybe that is part of why everything continues. Everything is too busy surviving their individual crisis to examine the larger crisis. We are all putting out little fires. Meanwhile, the forest is getting hotter. I don't think the end happens in one day. This is where people misunderstand me. When I talk about the end of the world, they imagine explosions, asteroids, nuclear war, some enormous final event. Maybe. But I don't think the end necessarily arrives like that. The end of the world can happen slowly. The Roman world ended, but there wasn't one morning when everyone woke up and received a message saying Rome was finished. Systems weakened. Institutions changed. Borders shifted. Trade changed. Authority fragmented. Generations were born into circumstances their grandparents would barely recognize. The old world faded. A different world replaced it. That may be what we are experiencing. Not necessarily the literal extinction of humanity. The end of a way of life. The end of assumptions. The end of institutions. The end of expectations. the end of the world as we understood it. And that can be terrifying because nobody knows what comes afterward. I keep watching people pretend. Sometimes I think denial is one of humanity's greatest survival mechanisms. We have to believe tomorrow will resemble today. Otherwise, how would we function? We make appointments for next month. We sign 30-year mortgages. We save for retirement. We plant trees whose shade we may never sit beneath. We make plans. That faith in tomorrow is beautiful. I don't want humanity to lose it. But faith in tomorrow cannot become blindness toward today. Something is happening. Too many people feel it. They may describe it differently. Some call it economic decline. Some call it climate crisis. Some call it technological disruption. Some call it political instability. Some call it spiritual emptiness. Some call it loneliness. Some call it cultural collapse. Some call it the end times. Maybe all of these people are touching different parts of the same enormous thing. Maybe humanity has reached one of those moments when history changes direction. And I wonder what comes next. That is the question that keeps returning to me. What comes next? I don't know. And anyone who tells me they know exactly what the world will look like 20 years from now seems far too confident. We have entered a period where prediction itself feels fragile. Technology could transform society. Wars could redraw alliances. Economic systems could change. Climate pressures could alter where people live. Political movements could rise and disappear. Entire professions could vanish while new ones appear. Humanity could solve problems that currently seem impossible. Or we could create problems we never imagined. That uncertainty is what I feel most strongly. The ground beneath civilization seems to be moving. Most people are still walking as though it isn't. This is only the beginning. I am not here because I want people to panic. Panic accomplishes nothing. I am writing because I believe attention matters. I want to look directly at the world instead of hiding from it. I want to understand what is happening to our communities, our economies, our technology, our environment, our relationships, and our minds. Because if this really is the end of an era, then I want to witness it consciously. I don't want to sleepwalk through history. I don't want to spend the final years of one world staring at meaningless distractions while another world is being constructed around me. Maybe humanity survives all of this. Maybe we adapt. Maybe the future surprises us. Maybe what looks like an ending from where I stand will eventually be remembered as a beginning. But right now, standing here and watching everything accelerate, I cannot shake the feeling that we have crossed some invisible line. Behind us is the world we knew. Ahead of us is something none of us completely understands. And somewhere between those two worlds, here we are, watching, waiting, trying to live ordinary lives during extraordinary times. And this is everywhere I look. I see signs that something is changing. I don't mean signs written across the sky. I don't mean that every storm, earthquake, war, or strange event is automatically a prophecy. I mean something much simpler. I mean the world doesn't feel stable anymore.